Well, good evening. Another group tonight. What would you all like to look at to start off with? In terms of sophistication, if not age. One of the most interesting aspects of the tradition that's here that doesn't really come into play until one starts to get a little more traction yoga is the way in which patterning is actually unpatterned. All of obviously experience is full of experiential characteristics which tend to show up tend to present in terms of all sorts of apparent patterning. You know, in the visual field, there's the patterning of objects, there's the patterning of color, there's the patterning of shapes, so on. In the field of sound, there's patterning of different frequency groupings and different, so on and so forth. But all this information that seems to appear within experience seems to present with an incredible degree of patterning, which of course is what gives rise to the consensus reality interpretation that because all of this is so heavily patterned based on, objectively existing objects, which actually just passes the buck because what's their patterning based on? But at any rate, so all of this pattern, all this intense patterning, of course, we're all very familiar with it, and it gives, most of our typical human functioning consists of relating to these patterns in various ways and orienting to them, and trying to juggle them, the pattern of your body and the pattern of your communications and the pattern of other bodies and the pattern of objects, and the patterning of the apparent interaction of all of these patterns and all of this. This is what constitutes normal human life. But the interesting, when you get to a certain point of depth, you begin to notice that the patterning is actually infinite. The patterns themselves are resolvable. This is actually a key point because it's from this that liberation is based. Liberation arises, but that's getting a little ahead of ourselves. So all of this apparent patterning is actually unpatterned. This is how liberation from karma appears, because karma is based on all of these patterns that one is seemingly embedded in. Patterns are actually unpatterned, and naturally karma is not what one thought it was. It's more implication than an actuality that one is actually stuck in or has to grapple with. So the principle by which patterns are actually unpatterned, unresolvability. In other words, if at first take, any pattern seems to be very specifically what it seems to be. You see a person sitting there, or you hear a sound, whatever sort of or experiential characteristics pattern seems to be present. It presents as a kind of a pattern, and if one doesn't look closely, that pattern will tend to stand up to scrutiny. But if one looks closer, one discovers that any and every pattern is actually unresolvable. That means pin down exactly what the pattern is. The pattern doesn't resolve to being precisely a certain way. There's an open-endedness. There's a fuzziness. There's a infinity of information that is intrinsically present in any and every pattern. That the flavor of a bottomlessness, so that every pattern has a bottomless richness. So if one looks into a pattern, one keeps finding more and more, and this more doesn't tend to align with previous discoveries about the pattern. It tends to diverge. So in other words, the more you learn about something, the more different it becomes from itself, from your first take on it. And this continues indefinitely. This continues endlessly. Looks experientially into a pattern or any degree of patterning to be a contact point with something which is absolutely indefinable, absolutely open-ended, and so not be felt to be a particular way, this or that, even though superficially, at a closer scrutiny, it seems very obvious that that's the case. But experience is made of specifics. Experience is not made of generalities. And patterns seem to be most coherent when one approaches them in the most general terms. When you get more and more specific with your actual experience phenomena, you notice that the more specific you get with it, the more open-ended it becomes, and the less resolvable it becomes, and the less coherent it becomes. So this is a very, very important principle in the yoga, particularly in you might say the higher reaches of it, or the more advanced stages of it. The initial stage of the yoga consists mainly of discovering prior assumptions and interpretive frameworks about what things are and what one is are inaccurate. And that turns the world upside down, and one discovers that the presence of the experiential field is the sole actuality, as opposed to a more consensus reality orientation, where it's held to be the presence of an objective world is the sole actuality, and that's what everything is calibrated towards or oriented towards. One looks a little scrutiny, one discovers that the objective world is guesswork, it's a hypothesis. The patterning, which appears solely within the experiential field, presenting with all of this information, is the sole actuality that can be found to be self-verifyingly existing. In other words, it doesn't depend you believing in it or holding it to be that way. It doesn't go away when you stop. Oh, there's no experiential field. It's like, yeah, that doesn't do anything. Powerful statement. It's not a powerful position because here it is. It's undeniable. And the nature of this experiential field is this that is here. It is actual, and it continually and continually and infinitely presents as experiential characteristics. And this continual presentation I sum up under the notion radiance, and the actuality, this experiential field, the self-verifying obvious fact of its actuality, I sum up under the notion of presence. So this is where radiant presence comes from.
There's something between patterning and indefinable patterns, which is a development of patterns. When you're confronted with patterns, they tend to give the appearance of morphing.
Yeah.
But that's not the same as actually a pattern.
Yeah.
Inherently.
No, but it's the same thing essentially. The intelligence is incredibly skilled at generalizing, and it nonstop, and you can't stop it from doing so. No matter how deeply you investigate patterning and discover more and more thoroughly its unresolvability, you'll still be pushing a threshold of holding it to be however you're holding it to be at that particular vantage point, because it's being created by the observer. And of course, this shows up as you know, this is all these artifacts of dynamism and all these, you know, morphing and all these other kinds of things show up as artifacts of the way this works. But none of them settle down or stabilize or resolve to actually being a way that you can find. And this, you know, this noticing mode of, you know, going deeper and deeper into patterns and exploring unresolvability more and more thoroughly is what the yoga looks like in its later phases. And at a certain point of this kind of investigation, one sees that, you know, it gets it's the habit of generalizing that, oh my God, nothing resolves. There's nothing here. There's literally nothing here. In the sense of anything that could be, it's not a simple non-existence. It's not a simple nothingness. It's obviously a very, very sophisticated and complex and nuanced nothingness, because it looks like all this without actually being anything. That, and one sees, oh my God, there's nothing here. There's no pattern. And at that point, one slips into a perspective of absolute flexibility and arbitrariness, which is what realization looks like. And this is not something that, let's see, this is something that's it's not something that's really approachable with the intellect. It's something that becomes engaged with very, very intimately, experientially, through exploration of texture, an exploration of dynamism. And notice, you know, this doesn't require different or separate or more elaborate techniques. Noticing spontaneously moves. In its initial stages, noticing is a kind of an oh wow factor of wow. It's just really different. There's so much more going on than I thought. But then after that becomes sort of more familiar, then the noticing tends to be checking out the panorama of experience more and more intimately, more and more sensitively and precisely. There's a kind of a learning curve, a spontaneous learning curve that the intelligence learns how to do. It learns how to be with itself more subtly. And as the intelligence ramps up into that the degree of more subtle engagement, then these various aspects of this become more and more apparent. So it all happens quite spontaneously. The trick is just noticing in the first place, which is simply open-ended engagement with actual experiential presence outside the context of any kind of heavy-handed interpretation.
So how does patterning relate to time?
Well, time is itself just more patterning. I mean, time and space both disappear at a certain point, or they don't disappear, but they're revealed as being arbitrary multidimensionalities at a certain point of investigation of unresolvability. all the sort of cross correlations that we're all familiar with in consensus reality, with time and space and eyes and color and all of these things that seem so obvious and clear and heavy-handed, they reveal themselves to be, in fact, very heavy-handed generalizations of a multidimensionality that is much, much, much more subtle, that in fact opens into, it can be seen in those terms, it can be easily seen in those terms, as we're all familiar. But, you know, with more subtle, with more intimate investigation, the arbitrariness of these classifications and sort of calibrations of orientation with space and time, and I mean virtually everything, shape, all of this thing, all just being very heavy-handed and clumsy and inaccurate in the face of the astounding, you know, infinitely subtle actually is here. Please pull up a chair. Yeah, you can put it wherever you like.
The process of interpreting never really shuts down.
Oh no.
It's an ongoing pattern.
Is it? Well, it is exactly so. All of these subsystems, they never shut down. And generalization and identification and all of these sorts of mechanisms that we all know very well never stop, but they themselves are active patternings, and so they are revealed to in themselves to not be what they seem to be.
So the identification seems to change from the content of familiarity of experience to the process knowing, the process of being aware.
Yeah, you could see that, because again, content per se is seen to be very arbitrary, and then the way in which this content seems to be arising, you call it, as you put it, process, is revealed to be what's actually here. There is no content. There is just process, which is the mechanism by which there seems to be content to various degrees.
So that's,
it's like dreaming. You know, it's all very, very clear and simple when you look at it in terms of dreaming.
so that can't be resolved, but it does seem to continue. I mean, that is what identification turns out to be.
Yeah, identification and pattern, you know, all these things aren't actually problems at all. They are just, again, they are themselves an exercise of intelligence. They create anything, so it's not actually causing any problems. And what these apparent mechanisms are in themselves is itself unresolvable. So they themselves open just to infinite bottomless mystery. I mean, that's one of the really interesting things about the yoga is, it's not a matter of leaving normalcy or leaving your personality or leaving your ego or leaving identification or leaving all these mechanisms. One discovers that these things are not what one thought they were, what one thought it was. Nothing is what one thought it was. Changing anything per se.
Would you say it becomes enhanced or developed or, well, I guess, becomes more dimensional as it's paid attention to more?
Which becomes?
The beingness,
yeah, one discovers, one's, there's a kind, as I said, there's a kind of a spontaneous learning curve for one's ability to be with this more and more subtly is developed or revealed or discovered. And as this develops, see more and more that is the case. When it comes to see more and more, the dimensionality of this and the open-endedness of this. I mean, it's like just through increasing sensitivity, everything progressively opens up more and more and becomes more and more dimensional and more and more astounding, basically. Simply coherent in the way that it may once have seemed. And that continues forever because, again, it's not something that takes you to a place. It's an ongoing free fall. It doesn't have an end. It's not a destination. It's more of a condition. It's more of a flavor.
subtlety is sensitivity.
Yeah.
Discriminate.
Well, the subtlety is revealed by sensitivity. You could say, in a certain sense, the sensitivity creates it. It was always there, but we didn't notice it because it's, the radiance is such that one can be with it anyway. One can be with it very heavy-handedly and very, with gross generalizations and very simplistically, as a typical consensus reality interpretation. But then as one develops more sensitivity, then that in itself reveals perspectives whereby different aspects of the radiance become more and more clear and are revealed more and more clearly, which gives the sort of the gross generalizations and simplicities of a consensus reality type of approach are just revealed as laughable. Not that they're less true than any other perspective. It means that no perspective is true. Every perspective is equally partial or equally arbitrary. It's like, what does the Grand Canyon look like? Well, it depends where you're looking from. View of the Grand Canyon is what the Grand Canyon looks like. It's not like, oh no, but what the Grand Canyon really looks like. You have to stand here and look there, and that's the real thing. It's not like that. Anywhere you go where you can see the Grand Canyon, that's what the Grand Canyon looks like. Real, it's all genuine. There's no hierarchy of this is truer than that. And for that perspective, consensus reality perspective is not less true, but with the assimilation and the, let's say, a knowledge of a certainty of unresolvability, then at that point you have like a skeleton key where you can go into any perspective whatsoever and they're all interchangeable. There's no hierarchy, there's no better or worse, and that's what liberation looks like. So liberation isn't getting away from consensus reality, You can be, you can hang out and you can hang out getting pissed off about politics and getting drunk and getting fights in a bar. And that's just as good as mountaintop and looking at the infinity of, dimensions unfolding in the, in the noosphere. Because again, it's a view of the same thing, just from a different perspective. And there's no hierarchy, it's not like, oh, but that's just what it really is.
It's true. If you are referring to it being true to your experience at the time.
Yeah, true is a bad notion.
What?
Everything is true. Because truth depends upon perspective, and perspective is arbitrary. What's the true view of the Grand Canyon?
But you're still using the word truth as if there is still truth.
There's nothing but truth. It isn't a single thing as composed to something else which is not true or less true. There's no not true and there's no less true. All there is truth. Anything that is, i.e. appears in experience, is true. And there's nothing else, there's nothing that's more true and nothing that's less true. Now, it's like from the point of view of the yoga, practically speaking, certain perspectives are powerful. They're powerful for exploration and discovery, but they aren't truer than more coarse perspectives, let's call them, which are not particularly useful for yoga. The point of yoga is to discover the range of phenomena, in the infinite range, not to go from untruth to truth. The starting point of normalcy, of consensus reality, of dullness, is actually not untrue. The only reason you would want to move beyond it increase your understanding of what is here. But it's not like you're leaving something that's less good and moving to something that's more good. It's not more true. And when and as you discover the subtlety and the multidimensionality and the inherent nature of what's here, that sheds light on all of its other perspectives as well. So the purpose of exploration, the purpose of yoga, the purpose of experimentation, get to something better. It's to see, it's to learn more thoroughly what this is. It's like higher education.
That's better.
It may be, it's advantageous, better. You don't actually get anywhere. It's like I may have a, an advanced degree and a doctorate in nuclear physics, but I still may be driving a cab. But I know that the cab is quarks. Quarks. Because of my degree. In other words, yoga doesn't take you to a better place. But it shows you don't need to go to a better place, because it shows you what any place is. That any place is transcendental, infinite open-endedness, infinite unresolvability. And you wouldn't know that if you didn't experiment, but it would still be the case if you didn't experiment, so you don't actually gain anything.
What would you say the difference is between gross and subtle?
Well, you can't define it, or relative. You can only talk about gross and subtle with regards to each other, because they're not absolutes. They're not like actual objective conditions where, okay, this is gross and this is subtle. really has to do with sensitivity. Subtle, you could say, is greater sensitivity or heightened sensitivity. Bandwidth, you might call it. Gross is less bandwidth or less sensitivity. You can think of it as sensitivity like the size of pixels, you know, or something like that. Like you can look at your experience here in terms of, you know, sort of very large pixels, or you can start getting more and more precise and start getting down to, you know, the individual photons flashing around this stuff. And it's the same phenomena, but you're full of observation is more you know, high bandwidth, you could say. But again, there's no absolute of high bandwidth or low bandwidth, so it's all relative. And you can't tell if you're at higher bandwidth and you're just there, you can't tell if it's higher or lower. Have something else there to compare it to, because it's not actually higher or lower. You know, anywhere in infinite dimensionality is the same as anywhere else in infinite dimensionality. You ever played with fractals in a computer? Sometimes there's a bunch of programs you can get. But a fractal is this amazing, it's like a very intricate sort of a mathematical pattern that's generated by a certain kind of equation, an inequality. And it's literally infinite. And it can be displayed in a graphic readout. This is great fun because the nature of fractals is very, very trippy and interesting, because no matter if you say you zoom into a fractal, so the fractal say looks like a pattern on your screen. Say you take, so here's your computer screen like this, you know, this tiniest little bit of the picture, and you zoom into it, and so that blows up and becomes the screen. It's something, a pattern is very similar to the pattern you started with, and you zoom into another tiny little one somewhere else screen, and you're looking at it's basically the same thing. So no, at any level of scale, it's basically the same level of intricacy. And this reveals very clearly this principle of that gross and subtle are only, there's no absolute grossness or no absolute subtlety, which is why with realization, it doesn't matter where you are, where you hang out. You can hang out in a really, what you previously would have classified a really gross perspective, because it's actually just as subtle as any other perspective. It's just another view of the same thing, and nothing is gained or lost by this sort of variability of perspective.
Seems like a huge change from believing in ideas of yourself based on your history and your culture, and then to not believe that.
Oh, absolutely. But any belief, from belief to direct experience. After that, there's not much of a change. It's just variations on the same thing. But you're right. The base change is belief. You know, the real. I mean, there's two real thresholds in yoga. One is your beliefs are inaccurate, which basically frees you from it. You see that what's here is beyond anything I've believed it to be, at which point the beliefs irrelevant, whether or not they're still lurking in the background. They're not being actively, you know, held to be relevant or true. And then the second base threshold, one gets the absolute across the board resolvability. which is this, the first threshold, the threshold where one gets outside of belief, is where one steps away from normalcy and dullness and is a yogi. And when one discovers the absolute universal nature of unresolvability, is the threshold of liberation, of realization. So there's not really any demarcations in yoga, and those don't really stand up to scrutiny, of course.
In a way, I mean, it's very exciting, but it's like there's really nowhere to get to. It's like it's
that only seems depressing when you, relative to the fantasy that there is somewhere to go. When you see that when the fantasy that there is somewhere to go disappears, then that's more of the nature of an interesting revelation. It's actually fascinating that there's nowhere to go. More sophisticated, open-ended implication than the implication of somewhere to go, of linear orientation, of hierarchy and infinity. Is really, really interesting. But it's interesting in a different way than the sort of simplistic, goal-oriented, winning the game type of, or interpretive frameworks imply.
It's like the one taste, and
Yeah.
everything tastes the same.
Yeah. And it's easy to, from the point of view of the fantasy of all this variety, which is actually separate from each other, that could seem like a really boring notion. But when you actually go into what one taste is, one taste is a bad way to put that. It's actually infinite taste. By its very nature, is not boring. It's only boring when you imagine it as you've lost something. Like jam, I'm just lost in the middle of infinity forever. Nowhere to go, nowhere to get to. I'm never going to win anything, never going to lose anything. Oh shucks.
Isn't infinity an interpretation?
Huh?
Isn't infinity?
Yes, it is. It is. But the reality of infinity, which is unresolvability, even unresolvability is an interpretation. But it's a subtle interpretation that powerfully indicates actually is. Infinity basically means more another. You have is more. So that as a thing is an interpretation. But that as, you could say, a principle of action, such as it is, is actuality. I mean, it's much clearer and simpler in the experience of it than in trying to think about it or analyze it or discuss it. All sorts of conundrums and murkiness and seeming contradictions. Whereas the actual experiential engagement is very simple and clear.
It seems like the only tool that I have to call something inaccurate is inaccurate in itself.
Yeah. See, again, is always relative. You know, you can say accurate if you have evidence that what is being posited as being accurate. You say, you know, anything whatsoever, you say such and such is accurate, and discover, well, but it's not really capturing everything that's there, then you discover it's not accurate. But again, accuracy and inaccuracy are relative terms that don't really apply because there isn't really any relativity in radiance. There's seeming relativity, but ultimately there's no relativity because you can't tell what direction you're moving in radiance. When you really understand unresolvability, you can't assess what's more subtle and what's more gross, or what's more accurate and what's less accurate. Because you can say, well, this seems, there's a shift of perspective, that you're moving from less to more of anything. Because there's no way to assess it. There's no way to get a handle on what it is. All you can say is it seems perspective. An infinity of different perspectives is pretty much all that there is. Notions like accuracy and inaccuracy are generated from a mindset where you can figure things out or analyze them. And as the yoga proceeds, at a certain point, that becomes, and you're just surfing a wave of experiential exploration. You don't have enough perspective to compare it to any seeming other perspective of surfing the wave at some other time or place or whatever. So at that point, these kinds of relative notions, they just fall away. They become less and less relevant. I mean, they have to be kind of bootstrapped into existence by sort of arbitrarily asserting them to be true, basically with no evidence.
But to say that any interpretation would be inaccurate,
Yeah,
it would not be either accurate or inaccurate.
yeah, you could say that, sure. And generally speaking, interpretations are inaccurate, but that in itself is very heavy-handed, because if you look closely, interpretations aren't really interpretations; they're unknown infinities. And all you have is an unknown infinity, so you can't really say anything about it.
patterns are seen more clearly from observing the gross nature of
Yeah.
what they have been.
Yeah.
Automated.
Yeah. Patterns are most seemingly in a condition in a mode of generalizing. Generalize, the more patterns seem relevant. The more you go to specifics and precision of what's present, the details, let's call it, of what's present experientially, the less patterns become relevant. Oh, thank you so much. And again, that, as one develops and gets more and more subtle in the yoga, generalizing or not becomes more or less arbitrary. Ultimately, you can't tell if you're generalizing. There's no such thing. But that's maybe getting ahead of ourselves.
You can see behavior patterns.
Sorry?
You can see behavior patterns.
Sure.
Repeat.
Well,
And repeat and repeat.
they repeat if you don't look too closely. If you look too closely, they're always different. When you're traveling in a spiral, it can look like you're going in a circle if you don't look too closely. You can say, oh, I've been here before. If you look more closely. That's why, that illustrates the way in which the more you're generalizing, the more viable patterns seem to be. Pretty much the same thing every day. That's from a general point of view, that may be true. But in fact, every single day is completely unique. I never have done the same thing twice. I've never seen the same thing twice. But that's getting more precise. That's looking more specifically at the experience, as opposed to sort of generalizing and, well, I get out of bed and I have my coffee and I sit around and I, do some chores or whatever, and then I, wonder what I'm going to do today, and blah, blah, blah. If you generalize enough, you can make that, yeah, sure, that's what I do every day. What a boring life I lead. But if I look more specifically at exactly what the specifics of exactly what the experience is in each instant, it's an inconceivable, unpredictable, surprising adventure that never repeats. So again, that illustrates the, being with it more precisely, being with this more and more with the specifics of what experience really is, rather than looking at it sort of from a distance of generalization.
Well, there are thoughts that repeat as a pattern, that control behavior, that seem to repeat the same similar words that restrict behavior.
Sure, but even that is, all of that is generalization, because the actuality of that from moment to moment and each occasion, if you will, is unique and different, and actually morphs and changes. There's actually no such thing as repetition. Repetition does not exist. It cannot exist. But if you look at things with enough generalization, it's easy to not see that. So it depends on how how precisely you're being with it. You know, an important, particularly in terms of yoga and practicing yoga, full principle is to remember that experience is made of specifics, it's not made of generalizations. So, for example, what you're seeing in your visual field right now is exactly precisely what's actually present, not the generalizations with which the mind may be characterizing it. And the specifics that are present in your visual field right now have never, these exact specifics have never been here before, will never be here again, they're already gone. But if you ignore the specifics and back into generalizations, you're backing away from reality, really. Then you can say, oh, here we are sitting around, God, we do this every Tuesday, it's so boring, you know, we're talking about the same old bullshit, you know, blah, blah, blah. It's not true, it's not actual. What's actual is specifics. Specifics are the doorway to liberation, doorway to realization. It's sort of the opposite of pop spirituality, where you're supposed to get all fuzzed out and spaced out, you know, with some sort of plain vanilla weirdness. But in actuality, if you go to, the more you go to the actual specifics, more precisely go to the actual experience in exactly the way it is what it is, the more you will discover liberation and realization.
Well, I was thinking of seeing a generalization first, just to be able to recognize something out of the chaos.
Sure.
See something we keep, and then you can.
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with that, you know. Generalizations aren't evil.
Yeah.
Only strategic from the point of view of yoga. You know, we're used to, you know, in sort of spiritual dullness, one lives in a world where one relates to everything in terms of generalization. So the path of yoga is a path of education, specifics, which is by its very nature realization, at least in that phase. The generalization is a mode, and it's not evil or wrong. It's as good a mode as any. Once you see that all modes are arbitrary. But when, you know, in dullness, you think that your generalizations are true, and then it's not arbitrary. Those generalizations are true; they're real. You know, what do you mean arbitrary? You know, and all of a sudden you're a fundamentalist. And so, investigating specifics is a way to discover the arbitrariness of realized perspective, which frees you up to be able to use generalizations without being trapped in them. You know, after realization, if you want to hang out in generalizations, who gives a shit? It's not any better or worse than anything else. Because every perspective is actually basically completely arbitrary.
Well, some are based on actual ability. I mean, we do seem to have a sense of skill in certain in a certain direction, and quantum physicists. The idea of quantum physicists is a lot different than the master.
Sure.
And to think that, you can't do something, there's a kind of truth to that, but you can't do it. But then, I mean, these are like generalizations that define your existence of what you think is true, not true.
Right. But they aren't accurate. Again, this is part of the mystery of karma, the mystery of the patternings, specifics. Patterns aren't nothing. Patterns are infinitely specific. You look exactly the way you look. It's not like, oh, you look like anything, If I'm looking at you or looking at the floor, because it looks the same. It's not like that. On the contrary, you look precisely the way you look. The details and the specifics is just a universe of precision, exactly the way that it is. But the exact way is itself infinite. And because it's infinite, it's not constrained. It is specific, but it's not constrained. The pattern can't contain anything. It can't limit anything because it doesn't have. It's made of infinite specificity, but that infinite specificity is literally infinite and open-ended. It's a very, it's a very subtle condition. You can't think of it with your rational mind. It's an irrational condition. It's not something that makes sense. It's intensely paradoxical if you try and. I mean, this is why unresolvability discovered typically through a protracted or intense kind of a yogic investigation, because it's so strange. Everything is precisely and specifically exactly the way it is, and nothing is any way. That's gibberish. That's absurd. It's and yet it's literally true. The way in which that's true, to see the way in which that's actually true is the important point. That's the powerful discovery. The actuality of unresolvability, and then with that comes the implications of unresolvability.
So can you speak more about unresolvability in terms of understanding seeing?
Unresolvability can't really be understood. Unresolvability is a continual loss. It's the fact that have arrived at dissolves, disappears.
Oh, okay.
So you can look farther, push the envelope until you arrive at something else, and forever.
Yeah.
You don't get anywhere.
Yeah. Except you actually have karma.
Yeah, but that's not just a game. To a game, it's actually the nature of experience that it happens to be like that. It's the nature of radiant presence. This that is here, and this is why it has to be explored experientially. because then you see that, wow, that's not just a philosophy or a concept or a really cool, trippy mind game. It's like, it's actually self-verifyingly the way what is here functions. You know, but if you want to try and understand unresolvability, it's continually having the rug snatched out from under you. Rip. Until there's another rug and then rip. No rugs. In a very active, dynamic sense. Or no perspectives, or no frameworks.
Well, you can see that with thoughts. I mean, you can see thoughts disappear when they proceed ideas.
Oh, yeah. Well, in some dimensions it's easier. It's more apparent and more obvious. In other dimensions, less so. Which is part of the necessity for yoga. It's easy to see it where it's easy to see, but where it's hard to see, you have to see it there too, until you get that, until it penetrates your thick karma that, oh my God, it's just the way everywhere. There's no privileged place that is safe from this, unfindability, unresolvability.
But physicality.
Yeah, sure, physicality, sensory experience, anything. Doesn't matter.
You can always see it from another perspective.
Yeah, exactly. That's another aspect. That's another way to put resolvability. Unresolvability is that any perspective is arbitrary, and what appears. Always remember an important principle: what appears is only an experience. When I look at you, there's not some you that I'm looking at. When I say looking at you is a euphemism for attending to the experiential presence that I'm calling you in my experience. So it's an experience. And experience by its very nature is continually slipping and sliding out from under itself. It's intrinsically absolutely unstable and absolutely inconstant and impermanent. Again, you can, the old look at a black wall experiment reveals that very, very obviously and very rapidly. Part of the way unresolvability is not observed is fantasies of objectivity. So while I'm experiencing you all these different slippery ways constantly every second, but they're just perspectives on the real you, which is sort of sitting there stably and not changing and more or less inert. Which is, it's literally what we do. You walk, you turn your head and the whole room shifts. I move my eye and the computer gets big. I back up, the computer gets little. But the way to ignore that is, but that's just the perspective shifting. But the computer is really there and it's not changing size. But that in itself is a fantasy. It's a hypothesis. It's a mental idea that's being held in imagination based on no evidence. The only evidence is experience, and the evidence the experience gives is one of absolute variability, absolute inconstancy. You cannot have direct experience of objectivity. So objectivity is a hypothesis, i.e. a fantasy. You can't disprove it, but it still doesn't, it's irrelevant because it's not actual. It can't be found as an undeniable self-verifying actuality like radiant presence can. The experiential field can't. Experiential field is not a theory. It's absolutely self-verifyingly actual. and no actuality other than it can be found. And there goes actuality, there goes objectivity. Objectivity can't be experienced. So that means it's not real. So all there is essentially is experiential perspectives, which are absolutely slippery, absolutely dynamic, absolutely inconstant, never repeat, etc., etc. And so in the face of that, what is any particular pattern? Because it's already something else. And it's never going to be the way that it was again, experientially. So what is it? No, good, thanks a lot. It woke me up enough to keep my tongue flapping.
I have two brains, and one of them is continually going around seeing everything and lost temperature. No, nothing's changing. There's another part that's just clinging like to that.
Yeah.
So there's just all, I don't know why I'm able to not let that go.
It's not important. This is fairly typical because in actuality, that's always the case. The mode of your personality that you have identified with most of your life, and of course it holds the objective world, and that you're who you are, and the world's what it is, and your situation is what it is. All of that whole mode is part of the human experience, and it's not liable to go away. But again, all of these different perspectives coexist with each other. It's not like anything needs to or even can completely resolve to just this or completely resolve to just that. So perspectives of personality, perspectives of identification, perspectives of heavy-handed interpretive frameworks, and all of that are a mode of experience of the human entity that are present as a subsystem, along with many other subsystems that don't necessarily have much to do with each other. The experience as yoga develops, one discovers more and more how fragmented and unintegrated one is.
That's for sure.
No, it is for sure, and it's true. I'm that way. I mean, I'm not one person. I'm like just this conglomeration of all these different modes that coexist, and variously they become, one or more of them will come more or less to the forefront, and so on and so forth. But everyone's that way, really. People, the pretense that you're you and you're all one person it's hogwash. Any part of the yoga reveals, when you begin to look at specifics, the specifics of the lack of integration of personality become more and more clear. And it's not a problem. It's just a fact. And it's important to understand that there's no bad modes. You don't need to stop identifying or stop having interpretations or whatever. the point isn't to stop or start anything. The point is to see what it is. And when you see what it is, you see that it's a relatively artificial mode that churns out, by its very nature, it churns out these these perspectives or whatever. But again, that's just there, but it's a small part of what's there. It's not particularly important, and it's nothing to feel like you're trapped in. The pop spirituality has spread all of these absurd fantasies of you have to lose your ego, you have to transcend being a human being, you have to this. It's hogwash.
Every time I think it's not right about something else. Oh no, I'm still cleaning it out.
It doesn't matter what you're doing. The only thing that matters is to see what it is, to see it. And in the seeing, you're free of being trapped in it.
I was reading about someone who's bipolar who had extreme versions of patterns, and she worked with it by reading names.
Mm.
And there's Judy. And so, I mean, it's a general thing at the beginning, but you actually can see patterns very clearly. And then work them down to
Yeah.
specifics.
Yeah. Patterning is a major mode we're all very familiar with. The point is to notice the context within which that mode exists. And the context within which that mode exists is not like that. I mean, personality-wise, I have a low-level autism in my personality, so I'm very familiar with patterns and all that stuff. It's not a matter. It's irrelevant. It doesn't matter, because even when that's present, that's not the only thing that's present. There's always, literally an infinity of other modes and perspectives that are simultaneously present, which are not like that. So there's no trappedness or stuckness. In a certain sense, the yoga is like it's a little bit like astronomy. An astronomer starts on Earth, and they're on Earth, and they take out their telescope and they look, and you see what's going on the moon or in the solar system or in other galaxies or whatever. But they're still on the Earth. It's not a matter of leaving the Earth. It's about discovering what else is there to discover the context of it. And so going into the specifics and discovering unresolvability isn't leaving someplace and going to something else. It's just from the perspective of your starting point, you're exploring a greater range of what's actually present that has been previously unacknowledged or hasn't been attended to. And the fact if you're still you and in your personality with your neuroses and all that is just completely irrelevant. It just doesn't matter. Like the fact that the astronomer is still on the Earth doesn't matter for relative to what they're learning by their studies. And what they learn sheds enormous light on what it means to be on Earth and what the Earth is, without having to leave the Earth.
There's some incredible pleasure that happens though when you find something that's true.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Discovery is a great joy. Discovery is the greatest joy.
Mhm.
In a profound sense, spirituality and yoga is hedonism. It's pure hedonism. You're going to greater and greater pleasure, greater and greater enjoyment of your experience. The experience turns out to be this wonderful, luscious, pleasure principle. And the more you explore it, the more that is discovered to be the case. By not investigating what's here, one cuts oneself, one may or potentially cuts oneself off from pleasure and the joy of what's here. So a large part of investigating beyond one's, normalcy is exactly this: to discover greater joy, greater pleasure.
This is passing pretty interpretive, but as I listen to you talk and I try to see where the energy or the information that is going, it seems to be contributing to this like structure of energetic interconnections, and it's tempting to place an importance on that process. Is that the karmic process kind of claiming whatever this other process is?
Yeah, it is, but it doesn't matter that it's that, because that doesn't make it. That doesn't in any way diminish its value. Continually, the ego will try to claim anything and everything that seems to show up. It's like, oh wow, look how great I am! I discovered this. God, I'm really so cool. I'm just a really just a superlative human being. But that's what the ego does. But that in itself doesn't invalidate what's going on. Because again, remember, everything is sort of fragmented and not integrated and going on in its own dimensions. So the fact that ego and structural orientation identification is trying to spin doctor things a certain way doesn't invalidate what's going on in other dimensions. And spirituality and the yoga, most of it takes place under the table, not explicitly. It takes place sort of behind the scenes. So it's not what you do, but what happens anyway while you're doing whatever you do. So your ego will be doing what it's doing and thinking it's, and trying to, own it and spin it and all that stuff. It's like, oh boy, I'm a great yogi. Look what I'm discovering. God, I'm so cool. But meanwhile, while that's going on, over here there's this other weirdness going on that is genuine and productive.
In some of the other dimensions, there's this seeming pressure to do something.
Sure.
It's not like I would know how to do what I was being asked to do anyway.
No, maybe yes, maybe no, but that's all. But again, that's just another dimension. You know, nothing in itself has any particular importance in terms of inner pressures or motivations or inner mechanisms. There really are. They just don't really matter. And they especially don't have the importance that they will claim to have. What's discovered in yoga doesn't really have much of a very direct impact on personality. It's more rarefied and more subtle and more ephemeral. So it's genuine discovery and it's transformative, but not of personality. So personality might not even know what's going on, or if it does know what's going on in any sense, as you say, it'll try and claim it as its own and make something of it. In a way, the discovery, in a way, spiritual realization is, there's an image that I see repeatedly in sacred literature, and you've seen it many times, that is actually very relevant, in my opinion. And this image is the halo. So you see a medieval picture of a saint, and there's some guy sitting there, blah blah, and they have this circle around them. Now the circle is not them; they're sitting there, but there's a circle around them, and it's a crude and graphic depiction of what might be called the aura. And spiritual work, by and large, takes place in the aura. It doesn't take place in the personality. That's not literally true, but that's very relevant. There's a subtlety and a power that develops that's in its own dimension that comes with, but it doesn't necessarily have a very direct impact on the normal identity and the normal personality. And yet it's apparent in its own way, but it's more like an auxiliary quality that's there, rather than some transformation of the normal, the more coarser embodiment. You can see with yogis and people that are beginning to get realization, you'll see their halo. You'll see they're starting to get a nice little sparkle around them. Everyone has that to a degree, but with a person that's beginning to get, that has more realization, there's a wonderful sort of a clarity and actual sort of a subtle potency to the halo, to the aura that might not be apparent if you look at them, the way they're behaving or their body. It's really actually very obvious when you notice it.
How do we look?
Huh? You're doing great, girl. You all look good. You all look really good. But the way that's depicted is I think really relevant, because it's always a circle that is that, you know, there's the person's there and they're just them, and then there's a circle that's sort of like an attachment. You know, it's sort of like something stuck. You know, it's like you have a toothpick and you stick a cherry on it. You know, it's kind of like that. It's sort of an addition, almost outside it, and in a way that's relevant.
Nice image here on the stick.
Some chocolate, please. In fact, it's really an interesting noticing is to tune into people's auras. It's just look at their aura. And again, it won't concretize into anything very coherent, but there's something there. But it's a great thing to train the sensitivity, because there's so little to go on. So, you know, it demands the sensitivity to rise to the occasion.
But it seems to me very clear about that. And all these holy cards have this.
Yeah, well, sure. I realize people have bright auras. Maybe a better way to put it is clear auras. To me, it's not necessarily brighter, but it has a I don't know. I can't verbalize it. What do you think, John?
Well, it's not light.
No,
It's not like
no.
it's a sense.
It's quasi-visual though.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, you don't actually see anything, but still, they sort of there's something there.
It shows quite clearly.
Yeah.
And I find it quite difficult to interpret.
Oh, it's impossible to interpret, but it's clear for me. It's very clear with someone who's been doing yoga, when they, you know, it's really obvious to see that it clarifies. You know the way I would put it is, it's like they have more weight in their aura than they have in their body.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's a really good way to put it. With people who are not realized, the aura is there, but their weight is here. Whereas when people begin to become realized, the weight is sort of, the center of gravity is sort of more out here and less here. I think that's it. For me, in terms of verbalizing, I think that captures it.
It's more like the clearer you get, the more it emanates.
Yeah.
It's not particularly good. I don't know, it's brighter, but it's not, that's not its thing. It's active.
Yeah, activities. Yeah, it's a good way to put it. Yeah. Anyway, it's impossible to verbalize. So.
Well, it's interesting that they usually show it as light or yellow. It has a golden, a very light quality to it.
Well, it is light. It is like light itself, and gold symbolically is held to be, you know, was the most precious metal, and alchemically and mystically. You know, the gold is attributed to the sun, and the sun is, of course, you know, the planet of radiance. I mean, there's a lot of tradition in the way they depict it. Of course, it's not literally like that. Still in all, it can be a fun and potentially valuable investigation to play with that stuff.
I find it's not as clear cut as
Oh, no, nowhere near. No, there's nothing clear cut about it. You know, it's vague and transcendental. I mean, it's unresolvable. It's concrete unresolvability. It's not a thing.
The Church of England does not have the round disc, they have a band.
Oh, that's right.
And it's very different.
Yeah.
And I never see a band,
No.
but I can understand the disc.
Yeah. Yeah. The sort of the medieval way they portray it, you know, where the person's in silhouette and there's like a, you know, sort of this big circle around them.
Yeah.
To me, that's they're trying to capture something that's genuine.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
But also not important.
No, it's not important at all.
More.
Sorry.
It's just more.
More. Please, sir, may I have some more? You do. It's quitting time, so good night, online people.